I remember when hardcore music was philosophical, artistic, athletic, fun, and real. I'm going to play an EP by a band called Confines. This record in particular comes from the year 2010. This is the Withdrawn EP. After the record is done playing, on the insert of the record, an article called The Fashion of Apathy. This is a philosophical essay that just takes up 2 pages of the insert of this record. I think in today's time, this philosophical essay is definitely something worth checking out. It's one of the best records in my collection. The Fashion of Apathy. Relentless warfare, global economic collapse, coerced nation building, political apartheid, environmental degradation, the erosion of civil liberties, submission is freedom, business as usual, and work will set you free. The once Orwellian has now become the norm. The world is sinking fast, and whereas one might expect a call to action, panic, or hysteria, the response has been resounding silence. This lack of outrage does not possess the reverent sanctity of an attempt to internalize and make sense of the abounding madness, but rather that of a childish effort to wish it all away while absolving oneself of culpability. But to throw one's hands up when they, too, have stirred the cauldron of our collective fate is not enough. The standard front line of defense against such forces, the disaffected segments of society, agit-propsters, musicians, and artists, has remained curiously mute. The prevailing trend within these circles now seems to be to eschew direct statements. Confrontation is out. The exploration of new thoughts and ideas is unfathomable. Social commentary is presently confined to a handful of established ideologies against which it is safe to vent one's rage. The big issues are left to the so-called experts. Who they are remains unclear, while the rest of us little people are left to wallow in unalloyed mediocrity. But we know that the divide between the personal and political spheres is a false dichotomy. One is inevitably affected by the other. The question then becomes, has their well of creativity been tapped dry? Or, more likely, do they simply fear being tethered to their opinions by their fellow tastemakers? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. An intense desire for peer approval has resulted in a paralyzing fear of ostracism. As the world has grown increasingly accessible, so too has the individual's social network, as is evidenced by the very rise of this term in everyday parlance. Consequently, the radar from which one pulls behavioral cues has gradually been inundated with signals. The result has been a complete loss of self. This loss has manifested itself in an overwhelming sense of isolation, further compounded by and reflected in this non-response. And while the desire for self-expression represents an inextinguishable flame, the fear of further alienation makes summoning the necessary courage a superhuman task. The importance of social acceptance is undeniable, and it should not be understated. It must be acknowledged, however, that such acceptance comes at a cost. Every tribe has its own set of rights and code of ethics to which one is expected to adhere in exchange for inclusion. Such regulation helps to define the group's values, guide social mores, and promote overall harmony. By breaching these ethics, one risks exposure as an outsider, stigmatization, or even banishment. As the number of others the individual looks to for pure approval has grown, so has the number of values one is expected to simultaneously adhere to, and thus has resulted in increased behavioral restrictions. Conversely, in the instance of groups whose collective identity is defined primarily in opposition, there are more and more demands placed upon the individual of what one must rail against. Even those who fancy themselves willful outsiders existing on the fringes of society subscribe to some concept of what it means to live in defiance of the social norm. They, too, look to the archetypal rebel as a source of social regulation. The ramifications of this collective amnesia are immeasurable, and for those interested, there is any number of tomes dedicated to the subject for the purpose of topical relevance. However, within the domain of punk and hardcore, it has manifested itself in a bogus, nihilistic affectation, as what was once a relatively small, clandestine group of individuals operating primarily outside of established channels has, through technological advancement, media fascination, and mainstream co-optation, an interesting phenomenon worthy of its own discussion, mutated into an almost unrecognizable caricature of its original ideal. The desire for authenticity is now at an all-time high. And amongst a pride that values subversion and celebrates one's failures and shortcomings above all else, the frantic chase for an ever-elusive sense of security by means of proving oneself the most convincingly hardcore has tilted an already extreme scale even further. Bands are now content to don the fashion of apathy. each on the hunt to prove they are the most depraved, deliberately obtuse and phlegmatic, and thereby beyond punk. Lyrics, artwork, and accompanying fanzines are now routinely devoted to espousing sexual violence against women and sexual sadism, as if such notions were anything short of the most pallid reflection of mainstream male culture. Ambiguous statements are made without being placed in any context to bewilder the audience and distract them from an absence of content. The anti-hero is championed, even when his actions are in opposition to the most basic tenets of what it means to be human. It may be dressed up as a high art, but its vacuousness cannot help but betray itself. That this is all an act of mere posturing, worthy of nothing more than our immediate dismissal, is made apparent by an unwillingness to stand in its defense by these so-called members of the avant-garde. Such obviously exaggerated and indefensible stances mirror the cost associated with this loss of self. Again, the desire to communicate through art and music is wholly natural, but when those who feel compelled to take up the tools of such trades are so riddled with insecurity that they fear their own experience somehow insufficient or unworthy, the result is a deluge of work that bespeaks the fear of alienation, as it is far easier to distance oneself from any criticism when there was little in the way of emotional investment. The concern here is not that people will succumb to this mentality, for anyone who is remotely perceptive can recognize this charade for what it truly is. The danger is what is being carried out in our name while we scuttle around making vapid statements that veil the way we think and feel, and the ramifications extend well beyond our microcosm. Now, instead of punks being angry and outrageous, the conservative right wing has appropriated our place in American politics. What's worse, they're accomplishing more than our movement ever did. Their brand of patriotic libertarianism may be presented as prudent financial advice for tough economic times, but it is actually a nefarious form of social control. It gives entire industries free rein to act with reckless disregard, while holding the poor masses underwater, all while assuring them it's being done for their benefit, and placating them with the bankrupt promise of the American dream, something we've known for years. Our unwillingness or our inability to articulate our thoughts has been perceived as tacit approval, their mandate to carry on the status quo. We're now standing in line to watch our future be carried out with the tide. In spite of posing as being more anti-societal than ever, the diluted version of the punk ideal we are presently faced with has proven extremely palatable to the members of the mainstream. This expansion to new audiences has been inversely proportionate to our generation of original thought. Our fear of rejection is directly contributing to our disintegration. Perhaps then, we need to exchange this cumbersome false shock value we've draped ourselves in for the willingness to incense and offend the world at large through our refusal to succumb to the mundane schlock they'd otherwise force upon us, even if it means jeopardizing our social status amongst our ranks. Do not let this be misconstrued as a self-righteous directive, for neither is it our intention to condemn nor to idly sloganeer. It is as much a self-examination of our motives as it is of others. The hope is that it might provide some illumination, and for those who are still courageous enough to cling to such notions, the hope for something more than simply circling the drain.
He's alive, and I'll show him to you. You follow old Rafiki, he knows the way. Come on!
Oh, how the turns have tabled. So now Somerville, the most liberal place maybe in Massachusetts. So if this isn't the measuring stick that this whole COVID thing has gone way, way too far, I genuinely don't know what is. Again, if Somerville is telling you no, that's the equivalent of either Bonnie or Clyde looking at each other and be like, hey, hun, I think we're pushing this a little bit too far. But I gotta say, this is the biggest W for Somerville in a long time. So shout out to this town. We must protect Assembly Row at all costs, by the way. Great place. Mark my words, in maybe a month or less, Michelle Wu's gonna have to concede this whole thing, chalk up the L, and try and win back the city of Boston after that. It's not gonna work. People are gonna hate her for the rest of their life, as they should. But what we're all witnessing right now is a genuine fight for the city of Boston. And for anybody not from Massachusetts watching this, if Somerville tells you no on a liberal policy, that should tell you where this
Please
thing
keep
is.
wearing your mask, even when you're out walking your dog. Right, guys?
Fuck you, Jill. You're a horrible fucking woman. This is why everybody hates you, Jill. This kind of shit, ineffective, fucking bullshit.
In the cradle of our past, I lay upon my back in a cave so shallow I could penetrate it only by squirming, not by crawling. There by the dancing light of a resin torch, I drew upon walls and ceiling the creatures of the hunt and the souls of my people. How illuminating it is to peer backward through a perfect circle at that ancient struggle for the visible moment of the soul. All time vibrates to that call. Here I am. With a mind informed by artist giants who came afterward, I peer at handprints and flowing muscles drawn upon the rock with charcoal and vegetable dyes. How much more we are than mere mechanical events. And my anti-civil self demands, why is it that they do not want to leave the cave? The stolen journals.
Stop!
I've seen politicians and corporate media continue to divide the country. And in June of 2021, after being promised that the COVID-19 vaccines were the tested, safe, and effective solution to the pandemic, I was seriously injured by my second dose of Pfizer. As a professional athlete, this came out of nowhere. I had spent the last decade relying on my heart and my body as my primary source of income. I was so used to it always working. Exercise was my outlet, racing bikes my job. I took that for granted, and in an instant, I went from winning mountain bike races to being completely bedridden. The last 7 months have been a revolving door of doctors, hospital, and cardiology visits. I've been unable to work and have spent tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket in hopes of getting my old life back. Immediately after my injury, I was quiet. I didn't want to create any hesitancy because I just kept being told my injury was extremely rare, and I drew the short straw. After suffering in silence for a few months, I was desperate to find answers, to finally hear something other than, we think this will get better eventually. I decided to share my experience by posting a video on social media, and over the next few days, I was flooded with comments and private messages from others sharing stories of their injuries. Within a week, I had received over 1,000 people's testimonies from all across the world. Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, all the symptoms were the same. Their experience at the hospitals was also the same. They just kept being told to hang tight and stay quiet. That was when I met this beautiful group of people behind me. The team of injured people at React 19 saw my story and reached out. They offered me some ideas for possible treatments and things that seemed to help ease their pains. I broke down in tears as I realized I wasn't alone in the search for answers. When I told them I had gotten thousands of responses to my post, they said, "Yeah, we know. We currently have over 5,000 members." I couldn't believe it. How had I not heard about these injuries before getting my shot? How were corporate media and public health officials still insisting the COVID-19 vaccines are completely safe and effective, especially if there's thousands of injured Americans in one online support group? It made no sense to me. I asked them naively, what about the companies involved? Shouldn't Pfizer or Moderna be responsible for helping the people that they're injuring? That's when I learned about the loopholes in the emergency use authorization. Until then, I wasn't aware of the fact that the companies selling the shots had been granted total legal immunity by the US government. Even worse than that, I learned that the COVID vaccines are not eligible for the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program due to their unapproved status. This means that none of the injuries behind me qualify for the government aid program specifically established to help injured Americans with vaccine injuries. Zero corporate liability, zero backup plan. What could go wrong? Well, since September, our little group of 5,000 injured people has grown to more than 12,500. Each one of my friends behind me represents more than 1,000 others in React 19 who have been injured by the COVID vaccines and could not be here today. This is real. People are being harmed. People are losing their livelihoods and in some cases their lives, while the government and companies like Pfizer sit by and watch. Not only are our calls for help being ignored, we are actively being censored and discredited by mainstream media. We are not conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers. We are Americans, just like you, from every different background possible. Yet we are united by one thing. We were asked to do our part by our country and then cast aside in the name of profit. Whether it's polluting our water, poisoning our food, or putting carcinogens in our homes, we know corporations cannot be trusted blindly. Yet here we are. Our government is failing us again. The fact is that private corporations are making billions of dollars conducting clinical trials on us at our expense. It is completely unacceptable. Today, I issue a challenge to President Joe Biden, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and CDC Director Rochelle Walensky. I challenge you to set up a meeting and talk to this group. Look them in their eyes. Acknowledge their suffering. Admit this is real, not just rare. If they won't talk to us, maybe Joe Rogan will. If they truly care about the health of the American people, they would approve these vaccines and make the companies responsible for the damage they are causing. If in fact these injuries are so rare, it won't impact profits much at all. I promise their favorite lobbyists won't be too mad. But to even consider requiring a vaccine that no one will stand behind is a total disgrace to the very idea of America. We shouldn't be here. This shouldn't be our responsibility. But thanks to the greed of these companies and the current administration, it is our reality. If they won't help us, who will? Please consider supporting the injured by texting REACT to 50155. And please join us in a moment of silence to acknowledge those who have been injured by the COVID-19 vaccines. My friend Ernest behind me, he lost his son, his 14-year-old son, to myocarditis from Pfizer. Ernest, your son's life deserves to be acknowledged. Your loss deserves to be acknowledged. We love you guys. Please join us in this moment of silence.
Judge Banks, you are a crazy jackass. You are a stupid asshole. You are an evil asshole.